Okay, it's just gone 10 past, so I think I'll make a start. Thank you everyone for coming when you're already overloaded with information and a bit jaded by the stage of the day. I'll try to. I don't have one here, sorry. Okay. Okay, is that a little bit better?
You want me to hold the microphone? Test that.
Testing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
You can either attach it to your belt or your pocket or put it in your pocket. Put it in your pocket or clip it onto a belt.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, great, thanks very much. Sorry, I always lose my voice on 2 12-hour flights over here anyway, and it never really comes back. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And already, as I said, everyone's pretty overloaded with information and had lots of talks on EAP from all different kinds of directions. So in this presentation, I'm reporting work in progress on a project which I've been doing with Alex Ding at the University of Leeds. And specifically, we're looking at the issue of operationalising the dimensions of academic language within disciplines. And our focus is on the multiple layers of knowledge and skill that converge in the use of language in any particular academic discipline. And as you know, there are a lot of research streams that investigate academic language, which are used to inform language instruction. And we do acknowledge the contributions from all of these research streams, but what we're doing is returning to the larger question of what actually constitutes all of the areas of knowledge and skill that relate to disciplinary academic language. And investigating this question then becomes a basis for further theory building. So my presentation has 2 parts. In the first part, I'll talk about our joint project in terms of its theoretical basis, in terms of Ferguson's theory of the 3 intersecting domains of disciplinary knowledge required to teach ESP courses. And secondly, so firstly, the aim, secondly, its basis in Ferguson's theories, and thirdly, existing academic language studies and their construct validity problem as a kind of justification for what we're doing. And then the second, I'll try to give a very quick example from the field of communication studies of some preliminary exploration of the influences on language which use these ideas. So in this part of the talk, I'll briefly outline the background to our work in terms of the theory and the approach that we're using. And I have to emphasise that we're at a very early stage and that this is a work in progress. So the overall aim of our project is to identify the areas of knowledge and skill required for a comprehensive operationalisation of disciplinary academic language. And the word operationalise in research methodology has a precise meaning relating to identifying particular variables in research. Here we're using it in the sense of developing a comprehensive approach to understanding disciplinary academic language and what are all of the potential areas of knowledge and skill that such language draws on, and how do these types of knowledge intersect and integrate when communicating in a disciplinary academic context. And as a basis for doing this, we're beginning with the particular theoretical approach that we talked about this morning, Ferguson's 3 areas of knowledge of an academic discipline. According to Ferguson, ESP teachers, and this was written in the 1990s, teaching a particular discipline need knowledge of the areas of the discipline's culture and values, its epistemology, and its characteristic, discourse, and genre. And just extending on that a bit, we're arguing that building on these 3 areas, that the language of specific disciplines integrates knowledge of the interactions of the discipline, which is sociological, anthropological knowledge, And these may include the community's structures, practices, gatherings, publications, networks, research and publication processes. Secondly, it involves understanding the epistemology of the disciplinary community, which includes the characteristics of the specialist knowledge of the discipline, how knowledge is created and validated through the discipline's research methodologies, and their theoretical underpinnings, which involve types of philosophical knowledge. And thirdly, in the area that we're most familiar with, it involves the discourse and textual practices and artefacts of the disciplinary community, such as its use of genre, text types, elements of cohesion, coherence, syntax, grammar, lexis, all of which fall within the areas of discursive and linguistic knowledge. And while this tripartite characterisation of the elements of academic communication attempt to account for this complexity, it's important also to acknowledge that the three proposed knowledge areas still relate to a unified phenomenon. That is, they closely intersect and interact with each other in particular academic communications. They're elements of an integrative working knowledge used when communicating within a discipline. So why are we doing all this? What's the justification? I've called it here the construct validity problem in academic language studies. So in research, construct validity refers to researcher agreement on the operationalisation of the construct. This means when researching a complex phenomenon, such as academic language, researchers should generally agree on the research approach and how the phenomenon should be investigated and described and analysed. Cohen, Mannion and Morrison in the Education Research Methods text say this type of validity agreement is sought on the operationalised forms of the construct. That is my understanding similar to what is generally accepted to be the construct? And however, and my second point here is that with academic language research streams, there is little agreement on operationalising the construct. Some researchers focus mainly on the social dimension. For example, the socially constructed dimensions of language have been considered by theorists and researchers in the New Literacy Studies School and more recently the academic literacies movement, and it's also been the focus of the North American movements of writing across the curriculum, writing in the disciplines, and rhetorical genre studies. The second point here, some focus on the textual and linguistic dimensions. These include the approaches to genre, followed by systemic functional linguists, and the English for specific purposes approach to genre, and also a lot of studies in this area involve corpus investigations. There's been very, very little interest in the epistemological influences on language. And by epistemological here, I mean the research methodologies of the disciplines along with their particular philosophical ideas. And finally, none really integrates all three knowledge areas. So therefore, given this situation, what we're trying to do is think about ways in which all of these dimensions of knowledge are integrated within academic communication. So our project therefore involves working on a theoretical book publication that will assemble all of these ideas, and it also involves carrying out some concurrent studies where we're testing and trying to validate this work. So as an early example of the practical side of this project, I'd like to talk very briefly about some preliminary work that I've been doing on academic language in the field of communication studies. The academic discipline of communication studies was chosen because it's complex, diverse, and language rich. It's a discipline that's incredibly had all kinds of streams of research and approaches. And what I'm looking at is what shapes the use of language in this field in terms of its social dimensions, its epistemologies, and its discourse and texts. So, in exploring the social dimension of the field of communication studies, I've been looking at its history, its communities, the diversity of theory and research approaches and debates, and this is background work which will hopefully lead to some ethnographic inquiry, which is still in the planning stage. So in terms of its history as a field of inquiry, communication studies was a 20th century creation that began with studies of propaganda in the 1920s, then developed further in the USA during the Second World War, involving social scientists from Western allies combining their efforts to examine enemy propaganda and also advise the allies on control of their own communications, their own propaganda, in other words. Its communities, the second point, it emerged from other disciplines such as English, speech studies, sociology and journalism, and through the processes of subdivision and specialisation. And within communication studies itself, these processes are constantly continuing, and there's always new groups, subgroups and specialisations emerging. It has a wide diversity of approaches to theory and research, and communication studies itself describes itself as an interdisciplinary field. It draws on a wide variety of approaches to its research. It has some very strong ongoing debates. One of the main debates in the subject of communication studies is the purpose and role of the field of research, and a binary debate is should it be to carry out what they call administrative research, which serves corporate interests or bureaucratic interests, which a lot of the earlier communication study research did, or should it be critical research, which explores social issues such as power structures, repression, inequality and social justice. In terms of its ontology and epistemology, up to the 1980s, communication studies followed the ontological view that communication is a process, the transmission of messages, involving and drawing upon something called Shannon's Basic Information Theory, 1948, and research on the stages of the process of communication were carried out to look at where communication was succeeded and failing. They drew on the social sciences, psychology, sociology, and they were essentially positivist studies. And they consisted, in my subpoints here, just to briefly describe, of large-scale audience surveys. They yielded quantitative data, and they were analysed by use of content analysis. Over more recent decades, an ontological view adopted by some, still a minority in communication studies, has been to see communication as the use of semiotics, the production and exchange of messages. And this approach is more concerned with how people interact with messages and text to produce meanings, has a strong focus on the role of text within a culture. In terms of research methodology, the semiotic view of communication has led to critical discourse analysis when applied to texts, focusing heavily on lexis, and multimodal analysis applied to images, screen and virtual media. So as part of my work in looking at how language is shaped in this discipline, I've been looking at the relationship between epistemology and the discursive and textual elements of writing. And specifically, I've been looking at case building and communication studies journal articles. And my aim, as I said, is to examine the influence of epistemology on the discursive construction of a larger academic argument or case. And the study's based on the assumption, which most of us are pretty familiar with, that a published journal article has the goal of presenting an extended academic argument or case. And the article is arguing for the truthfulness or the validity of the research undertaken. And what I'm particularly looking at was whether or not such case building in article writing would differ according to the epistemology of the research that's being reported. And if it does differ, how? And the research area in which I've been doing this investigation has been, I've been looking at more recent communication studies articles that have examined the spreading of disinformation or fake news through mainstream and social media. And the sample of articles that I've looked at so far, looking at this, are 10 articles that have investigated some aspect of the issue of disinformation, fake news, as I said, mainstream social media. They were published within the last 4 years. They appeared in peer-reviewed communication research articles endorsed by the US National Communication Association, the NCA. And of my 10 studies, 5 of the studies were positivist surveys using quantitative data. 5 studies were interpretive case studies or ethnographic interviews using qualitative data. And the following frame just gives you a sense of the articles that I've been looking at. All of them are related to some aspect of communication of disinformation. And the IRA, somewhere you find in there, it's not the Irish Republican Army, it's the Internet Research Association, which is a Russian institute which disseminates, which fake news or manipulates Twitter and other social media organisations. So how the the social dimension of the articles was around an overall concern about disinformation through public media, and some of the issues mentioned in the articles I've listed here. I'm not even going to attempt to read it. These are just from the key words taken from some but not all of the articles, but you get a sense of what the researchers were looking at. So how does epistemology shape discourse and text? So what I'm finding is that it shapes the overall argument within the articles. The structuring of the argument or the case building differs quite markedly between articles where the research methodology follows a positivist approach and those where the researchers follows an interpretive approach. And these differences were particularly evident in the introductions and the conclusions of, or the discussion sections of the articles, where the where the researchers use evidence to conclude their case building. So just before I talk about the positivist articles, I'll just review the assumptions of positivist research, which we all know is knowledge is absolute, stable, it's based on a realist view of the world. It can be associated with determinism or the search for cause-effect relationships. It's based on the belief that there are general laws governing behaviour, characterised by the use of the scientific method, combining induction and deduction to establish general laws, and associated with quantitative or numerically based methods. So effectively that was the epistemological background to 5 of the articles, and what I found interesting was how it influenced the structuring of information in the writing. So the positivist articles and the introductions very much followed a problem-solution structure. There was a situation or an outline of the context. There was some kind of problem involving causality, and the research was presented as a solution. Now, a lot of you ESP people, or those of you familiar with Swales and genre analysis, would say, why didn't you do a move analysis? I could have, but what I found was actually the problem, Hoey's situation, problem solution, fitted really nicely as I looked at these articles. It was kind of a general procedural knowledge that worked. And even John Swales in his 1990 book talks about earlier researchers that used problem solution to look at research article introductions, people like Toulmin and Sapin. So I found that in the introductions, and what I found the conclusions of these articles was not particularly surprising for those of you who are pretty familiar with this sort of research. A summary of the findings, confirmation or refutation of the cause-effect relationship, the limitations of the research, and its implications for future studies. The other 5 research articles also addressed the issue of disinformation, but they were based on the assumptions of interpretive research. And I'll just review those here. Based on the belief that there is considerable personal freedom in relation to behaviour, emphasises the individual rather than the group, examines how the individual creates, modifies and interprets the world, sees knowledge as relative depending on circumstances rather than absolute, tends to use qualitative non-numerical rather than quantitative methods. And here you'll notice quite a difference in terms of the introductions and conclusions of these articles. So the interpretive articles involved quite a detailed description of a phenomenon, and often there was a bit of an information gap as part of that description, and then they would end with their open-ended research goals for investigating the phenomenon. And it sounds a general description, but it has to be general to fit all of the articles, obviously, and it was very much quite different from that problem-solution structure of the other one. But the biggest difference I found was in the conclusion, the discussion sections of these. These were written like extended essays. They had a thesis statement, and they were supported by points, which could be a finding, or it could be the implications of a finding. So these were quite tightly written, very readable kind of essays, if you like. very different from the move structure, which is more familiar, which you found in the quantitative positivist articles. So just some preliminary thoughts so far as I conclude. Understanding academic language as it's used in a disciplinary context seems to require a holistic approach, avoiding the atomism of a lot of the research that's been carried out in this area. A caveat to that is a lot of the atomistic studies give us a part of they're like a jigsaw puzzle. They give us some of the parts of the puzzle, but they don't give us the whole overall picture. And what I'm trying to do is stand back and get a wider lens view of things, as it were. Second point is disciplinary language may be shaped by different macro level influences, social, epistemological, discursive, and there is a case, I think, for considering how these types of macro level influences shape disciplinary communication. As I said, it's very much just a work in progress. I probably need to find some more articles and develop this a bit more, but that's where I am at this stage. So it's to be continued. So thank you very much for listening anyway. So anyone got any questions at this hour? Yeah.
So you chose 5 articles from each type, or was that just the way that it fell? Is it roughly proportional, half and half, or from the sample of all the papers that you looked at?
I looked across a lot of journals, I looked at a lot of articles in this area, and at the moment, yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's a roughly equal distribution of the quantitative, more positivist content, more traditional communication studies articles, and there are quite a few more. Now, in my abstract, I actually said I was looking at critical theory ones, and that was not included today because I actually re-looked at my interpretive ones and found that they are quite critical, but they don't have a critical theory agenda in them. That they tend to be just more purely interpretive. Yeah. So yeah.
Follow up, if I may.
Yeah.
Was the actual topic? Were the topics slightly clustered at all?
No. So they're very dispersed, I have to say, across the journal. But there are a lot of articles there. It's obviously a hot topic, disinformation, fake news in the current environment. So the communication studies people have been very busy at investigating it, yeah. Yeah.
Have you come across any kind of mixed methods that try to do both?
Not really, no. Which was interesting. And the other thing I have to say is, I think even though the disinformation articles that I found were pretty evenly distributed between interpretive, meta-analyses by communication studies is an interesting field because they document themselves a lot. They've written, every 10 years someone writes a history of the field, which made it easy to look at, and also in some of the some of the journals, some of the editorials provide kind of overviews. So it's kind of an easy field to get into because it's very self-reflective. But overwhelmingly, there's still quantitative content analysis, I would say. They themselves said there hasn't been the shift into more qualitative. So qualitative articles are usually a minority in that field, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Have you thought about applying this approach to pedagogic contexts, like the communication studies course, kind of assignments they set?
I haven't got that far yet, Rob, sorry.
Is that a plan?
The plan really is, what Alex and I are really trying to do is write a book about all the dimensions of academic language, which doesn't even have a specifically EAP focus, which is for a very wide audience, and then people can take out of it what they want, really. I think EAP and ESP have given us this huge body of literature, but when you look at it, if you heard me this morning, it's reifying around certain methods and approaches. The number of corpus studies in ESPJ from mainland China is huge in recent years, and they're very meticulously done. And I'm not criticising them, but I'm saying that I think we have to spread the net more widely. And that's sort of the view, the agenda at the moment. the application isn't really been sorted yet.
I was intrigued by the fact that you dismissed the suggestion to just do a moves analysis. And I just wondered whether the reason that you dismissed that is because you felt that a standard moves analysis would just provide a descriptive snapshot of what's there, whereas an epistemological analysis would provide maybe a more explanatory account of why the moves are there in the first place. Or am I misunderstanding?
I think that my choice of problem solution rather than move analysis is still really in the discourse genre area. And the only reason I chose it is that I think procedural knowledge should be really general so that people can apply it creatively in their own areas. And sometimes move analyses can be very prescriptive, and sometimes they get some of the more recent move analyses get down to a very micro level. And even John Swales himself has written about the need for us to spread the net, his 2019 article more widely. I'm not condemning move analyses. I just found that just seemed to fit better than what I did in terms of problem solution.
As a follow-up to Julia's question,
Yeah.
Because you're talking about Swales, sorry, Kevin.
Yeah.
He was saying something about how, I had to look it up because I don't want to misquote Swales because that's probably sacrilegious.
Especially in this context, yes, it would be.
Gallows. Yeah, exactly. But he was talking about how the major differences usually don't lie in the introductions, but introductions and discussions, but actually in the methods and results section.
Yeah.
When it's disciplinary, I wondered if because they're the same subject area, that's why you focused on introductions.
I was really looking at the argument. I was going back to the idea that an academic journal article is really a case, an extended case, and methods and results. Ages ago, I can't remember who it was, said that working scientists in biology, 1955 book, I can't, the reference, will read the abstracts and they'll read the discussion sections. And then if there's anything more interesting, they'll read the rest of the article. And really, I think the case, the overall argumental case emerges more in the opening introduction, maybe before the literature review even, and then in the concluding section. So it was really this more macro level, the look of the argument. Yeah, I'm not disputing the fact that the other sections could be enormously different, but I was looking really at how the argument is presented and how it's different in the two. Again, because procedural knowledge should be fairly general. Once it becomes too specific, it becomes less usable, I think. That's my kind of point.
So I was in your session this morning as well, so thank you very much for that. And I was just wondering, it seems that the idea might be that the disciplines themselves are very clear about their epistemologies and how they're representing them. And I just wondered what your perspective might be on when we get things like in the field of psychology, there seems to be quite a lot of discomfort and awareness that sometimes qualitative studies are being written with sort of nods to more positivist styles because they think it has more validity or they're trying to get into a certain journal. Yeah. And there's a sense that, you know, in the field there has been poor teaching of psychologists over, you know, decades in terms of understanding the paradigm they're operating in. And therefore the way that students and then practitioners are publishing is to some extent confused. And so the language choices and the argumentation and all that is sort of a bit dynamic and in flux because there's a lack of consensus sometimes or agreement on what the paradigm should be and why.
Jacob says that disciplines have very fuzzy boundaries, and I know that much because I've written that chapter, but I used very clearly distinguished research methodologies, the positivist, interpretive. Of course, in the real world, they're much more hybridized. Or in a lot of studies, I say, they are much more hybridized in the way that you said, and that could certainly, you could certainly see in the presentation of the argument something that which veers much more to a positivist structure or something that is more interpretive. So things are much more mixed and hybridized in all sorts of fields. There's different branches of psychology, of course, so you get some that are very traditional and very positivist, but you're going to get social psychology and others where there's mixed methods or it's qualitative, but yeah. And of course that would have an influence on the writing, absolutely, yeah.
Following up on both those things, I wonder if looking in the way that you have at introductions and conclusions in that way, maybe helps polarize the positions rather more than looking at how the argument unfolds itself. I'm thinking of looking at a problem solution, which is a paradigmatic positivist stance.
Yes.
It helps your argument, doesn't it, that there is a distinct difference here, rather than if you say use the Cars model, then you might find greater similarities in how the two epistemologies are being presented.
Yes. Yeah.
It also strikes me that this is a bit similar to our own field, that there are competing complementary epistemologies,
yes.
and I wondered if it would be interesting to look at reference space and see whether people are reading each other. Is there a lot of interaction between the two, or are these two diametrically opposed camps?
Yeah, I think they're good points, Ken. Yeah, I think that the problem solution does definitely emphasise the more positivist approach, and that a move analysis could actually blur, or could be maybe applied commonly to both. When teaching students, sometimes a simple piece of procedural knowledge can be helpful. Maybe it's a useful way to look at different articles and see the common features of how the problem solution thing is unpacked in positivist articles, yeah. Again, Jacob's book on interdisciplinarity is quite interesting in that with all the recent arguments that we should be moving to interdisciplinarity, one of his arguments against it is he said most disciplines cite across, if you look at citations across disciplines, are very cross-disciplinary, even in a lot of the physical sciences. And he quoted, it's a bit old, it's 10 years old research, Eigenfactor and other research, which showed that even quite demarcated disciplines still, in the modern era, will cross-site across other disciplines. But maybe that's not quite exactly what you were talking about. I think everyone needs a cup of tea, actually. Anyone else? Sorry. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and listening.